Go ahead, you start. All right. Hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. It's nice to see all of you. I know I've been kind of MIA this semester a little bit, so nice to see so many familiar faces. All right. So we'll get started. We're really lucky to have Jill here, okay? Particularly as a room full of designers focused on the built and natural environment. You may sometimes find yourselves asking a deceptively simple question. Should we design? When should we design? Should we design now? Should we design this, that? We live in a society shaped by continual cycles of growth and redevelopment. And as designers with economic imperatives and incentives to design, the impulse is often to intervene, to transform, optimize, or improve upon a site. Yet, sometimes the most deliberate design decision is to refrain from intervening at all. Choosing to let a landscape rest, evolve, or remain temporarily unresolved can be just as intentional as the many hours that we might spend developing a more formal proposal. Work like Jill's invites us to reconsider these moments of restraint, to recognize that landscapes also need time to unfold, and that vacancy, fallow ground, or apparent inactivity can hold their own forms of potential. So with this, it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. Jill is a landscape architect, researcher, and educator whose work explores how design can engage the overlooked and the often undervalued landscapes of contemporary cities, places that are shaped by abandonment, shifting economy, ecological processes, and long cycles of urban change. She currently serves as associate professor and program director of landscape architecture at the University of Connecticut, where she leads the program and continues a body of research that bridges design practice, spatial analysis, and critical inquiry into the future of urban land. Many people first encountered her work through the widely acclaimed book From Fallow, 100 Ideas for Abandoned Urban Landscapes. With that book, Jill invites readers to, quote, think differently about pre-existing conditions and to be particular about them, unquote. Particularly when it comes to thinking about abandoned or vacant land. Through a series of design ideas and precedents, she demonstrates how these vacant lots and their unique conditions can become laboratories for ecological processes, inclusive public spaces, and new forms of urban stewardship. Her work also extends into questions of representation and mapping, one of my favorite topics. Jill is the co-author with Charles Waldheim of Cartographic Grounds, Projecting the Landscape Imaginary. This book celebrates the foundational techniques of mapping, from contours and cross-sections to figure ground drawings, while also offering critical perspectives on our contemporary reliance on data visualization. The book argues for the continued relevance of traditional cartographic techniques as tools for imagining and shaping the ground itself, which, explains why it's become an important reference for designers thinking of how representation shapes the way that we understand land and territory. More recently, Jill expanded her work on abandonment and urban change in her latest book, Cyclical City, 5 Stories of Urban Transformation. Here she examines case studies within Philadelphia, Berlin, Lisbon, Amsterdam, and St. Louis to explore how landscapes evolve through cycles of growth, decline, and reinvention. Rather than treating decline as inevitable, the book asks how designers might work productively within the temporal rhythms of urbanization. So I'll shut up because I'm sure she's going to talk a lot more and show us some pretty cool examples of some of the work that she's doing that's contained within some of these books. Again, I think her work raises really compelling questions for us, and I'm sure tonight's lecture will spark even more ideas and conversations. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Jill.
Awesome. Thank you, Faye, for the generous introduction, and I'm delighted to be here. I got the opportunity to see a lot of the great work happening in landscape architecture. I think Gail wrote a review of a book, so I owe thanks to that. Keith Caseman taught me to draw in Rhino or to model in my early education, so it's nice to be back here and to see many friends, colleagues, former students, and current students. I think teaching defines me, so it's exciting to see all of the things that you guys are working on in studio. And I'm excited to share a few ideas from my research and teaching. I'm coming from Boston today, so I apologize if I brought winter with me. It felt like spring to me, but I don't know, it's getting increasingly winter-like. I'm going to start with this image, and maybe to the students here, this might sound terrifying, but this has been a decades-long project for me, and so to date myself now more than 2 decades long. It began here in Philadelphia in graduate school, so if you're kind of concerned with something now, just a gentle warning that you might be concerned with it in a couple decades, and you might sort of follow that winding journey with you. This is the North Central neighborhood. That was my car at the time, and I did a graduate thesis project here. I tried to combine a thesis in architecture and landscape architecture, which taught me a lot about how the disciplines communicate together and how they don't communicate together. But I was struck by the openness and space that this image implies and appalled by the policies of continual forced displacement, which were continuing to happen at that particular time. And so I was concerned by this sort of polarizing image that you see of deliberate abandonment. So I think when Faith talks about doing nothing, I don't think that is actually withdrawing resources or being deliberate about leaving some people out of the conversation. It's something quite different. So that was deliberate abandonment on the left, and this was new development on the right. It was being driven by the then Mayor John Street's Neighborhood Transformation Initiative. And these two landscapes were literally across the street from each other. I took this picture facing one direction and facing the other direction. And so I embarked on a thesis that could never be answered in 1 semester or even 2, to think and design through other alternatives and future scenarios to imagine ecological and social wealth for the fallow urban landscapes. And then to give a little bit more context, to this day, my research focuses on design strategies for abandoned urban land, especially in places where there's been widespread disinvestment or population loss. It does so in a very different way than it did then, but it sort of argues that we think a lot about designing for a place, sort of planning for a place, but we don't think so much about unplanning it, and these responsible proposals must contend with a fragmented footprint and interweaving through existing development, heavy constraints, few resources. And at the time that I started this project, there was a lot of work in the art disciplines, even in architecture, thinking about these issues, but not so much within the landscape discipline. And I think time is something that landscape architects think a lot about. And so you have to sort of think through time and think through multiple scales of time to address some of these issues. And then as I sort of developed this work and continued to develop this work, I began to think a lot about the landscapes we've abandoned in the past and how maybe understanding the failure within that project would allow us to design a more conscious path forward as we think about landscapes that might become abandoned due to climate adaptation and risk. Could we actually learn something from 100, 200, 300 years of abandoning landscapes as we move forward with the project? How can our understanding allow us to approach that transformation differently? And so I'm not going to offer you any answers today, so hopefully that's not a big disappointment, but I'm going to talk through some of the observations and ideas that I've had around that that come from a series of publications. And I think in all of my publications, I used to joke, Charles Waldheim had hired me into academia, and I was like, I deliberately chose a discipline that wasn't focused on writing. I have an undergraduate in urban studies, and I want to draw things. I like to draw things. I like to make things. And so I think all of the publications are these combinations of text and image. I like making the images for the text. Cartographic grounds was a slight variation, and if you had to get that many image permissions, probably that was a one and only time for me to do that. But you can sort of think about the sort of publications and the relationships between words and image, and I probably also won't write 95,000 words ever again either. So, but it was a joy to do so. And these books, they really talk about alternative narratives for fallow land. ones that both frame the land itself as valuable, so as not residual, and the people not so much as the people, not talking about the people who've left, but the people who've remained. So to frame that land as valuable and to uncover the policies and justices behind its formation. And so I taught a class a little bit about land and land processes, because people see vacant land and they imagine an idea for it, which you'll see I also did, and they don't realize all of the underlying policies and forces that are actually holding that land in that space. And then, as Faye mentioned, I'm also interested in different ways of drawing through these and work that centers multiple time scales in the endeavor. So I'm going to spend most of my time talking, well, I'll spend part of my time tonight talking about these two books, and then some of the time talking about my observations out of them. They're very different books in their making and their ambition, but to me, they're one project. They're one inquiry that's expressed in two different forms and two different time scales. So both the time of making them, which was very long for the book on the left and much quicker for the book on the right, but also the narratives that they sort of embody. And so I came to academia from practice, and I think when you do that, people ask you, what's your research going to be about? And I was excited to re-engage with the context of urban abandonment, thinking, I think very much like a practitioner, that I would produce a set of case studies of best practices, of things that people were doing. So I started to gather these case studies, but as I started to gather them, I realized there were a lot of quick ideas out there, and perhaps it was these longer stories and these longer narratives that what was missing. And so abandoned property has long vexed cities, especially the architects, landscape architects, urban designers, planners, and citizens working in them. And in the past decades, there have literally been hundreds of ideas for abandoned property that have emerged. Some remain purely speculative, while others have been tested and implemented. But at the same time, this preoccupation nor the accruement of abandoned property has abated. And so you could argue these fallow landscapes are everywhere, and everywhere they're distinct. Even in the places with the greatest growth, the greatest kind of accumulation of population and people, there are fallow landscapes in particular neighborhoods. And so the goal here was first to look at their idiosyncratic potentials without disclosing their identities. And so to kind of make the argument that a piece of vacant land isn't one thing, it's many, many things. So it's an attempt to look intently at the present lived condition as the reflection of a complex past, but in order to imagine this equally rich and varied future. And in a lot of these examples, I think it's not a matter so much of making drastic change to the sites themselves, but drastically reimagining how we approach and manage them. In the end, I think it sort of came out as a love letter to the American landscape. It's the result of thousands and thousands of miles of driving. I think one of the things people always ask you for a quick fact about yourself, and I always say I've been to all 50 states. That's my sort of quick fact. Part of it is because my family didn't often choose to fly, so I've driven across this country many, many times, and I continued to sort of drive and meet people and collect information, I sort of became to realize that the project that needed attention wasn't the collection of things that people are doing. When you get out there, people are doing amazing things. But I had collected all this information. From Fallow was sort of the second project. If cyclical cities is the first, they sort of came out in the reverse order because I had collected all this information about the cool things that people are doing, the places I'd visited, and I wanted to debunk this myth about the vacant lot as being one thing or one scale or uniform in any way, to offer a kind of what I call a forward-leaning, landscape-driven reflection, a kind of to think about the present future as an act of narrative revision. And I think a lot of my work kind of lives in this space as an act of narrative revision. So you're sort of seeing it flip through here quickly. This act was organized around these 100 ideas, each of them sort of represented by an icon, but also around themes. So the themes are actions, they're active terms, they're landscape ideas, find water, produce energy, grow crops, embrace people, form property, et cetera. But the idea was that they be a kind of an action. I guess I'm always sort of looking for action. We're looking for the ways in which we can act and be and do. Each place is sort of, in the way in which I conceived of it, is matched with a scale and a landscape that would allow me to draw out specific qualities or histories. For example, the drive-in theaters in Camden, New Jersey, where there was the first recorded drive-in theater, or the water squares in New Orleans, where you can merge floodable landscapes with landscape forms. And something maybe else to say about this project and sort of the question behind it is I was curious. At the time, people were talking a lot about shrinking cities, and there was a long list of shrinking cities. And in my head, I was like, how can you equate all of these places together? Like, how is Washington, D.C. like Detroit, like Pittsburgh, like New Orleans, like they're very different places? What does that mean, a shrinking city? And how can we sort of grapple with that question, which is, so the places are places that are sort of determined statistically as shrinking, as having once half their peak population. And so that was the sort of idea there. And then each example, we were talking a little bit earlier about methodology, and so normally I draw first. In this project, I wrote first, so I wrote these sort of small snippets of what I kind of imagined the place to be, and then I used those as drawing prompts. And so there's a sort of short text around it, there's a sort of zoomed in scale, and there's this idea of what is the kind of regional scale or the regional adaptation of it. So they're contextual, they're specific, but the sites have been left anonymous as a way, on the one hand, to open imagination, and on the other hand, to sort of recognize that any one moment is static in time. As you like put something on a map, probably it's already changed a lot since then. And so they sort of invite that imagination and that openness without sort of addressing that change. Maybe one of my favorite parts of the project is the ideas are accompanied by a visual index that explains the application, thinking about inputs, so inputs in terms of how long might it take to make this change? What might be the cost of it? Could one person do it? Could many people do it? Do you need a landscape contractor to do it? And how do you have to start to maintain it? Because in some ways, vacant land falls into this cycle. It's a little bit recidivistic in that sense. And so you do want the kind of, and if I would argue for anything, it's sort of the long-term engagement that matters. So the act is quick, the act is important, what you do matters, but I think how you engage it long-term matters, and it's something I've been trying to, I guess, follow in my work as well. And then from the environments, is it better in the daytime or nighttime, cold or hot? Do you want pollution? Do you not want pollution? What kinds of elements would you have? What kinds of topography? How is the ground? Who might be using it? And what sort of overall scale could you imagine? And obviously, these things are sort of flexible. It's hard to answer these questions for any one thing, but sort of try to dry out each of the ideas in this particular way. I had the opportunity to kind of create an exhibit around the work, and we chose together as a team to think about a fence, and a fence as an armature for its sort of polemical qualities, and also to sort of think about constructing things with raw materials. I like to say to people, design isn't about, it's about doing the most with the least, and if you really think spatially and design well, you should be able to design with any type of material. So we used readily available materials that were raw. Some people hated it. I think some people liked it. And then we sort of layered it. So you could sort of think about the layering of context and ideas. So things could start to overlap. The spacing of the fences relates to the themes in the book. So the wider the spacing, the more ideas sort of fit within that theme. And then you could sort of, you can kind of see it. And the other thing is a book as an entity is a linear thing. So it's fun to think about something in this exhibit space. You move around it. People might approach it from different ways. There's a staircase. There's a couple different exits. So you get to sort of think about the project less in that sequential way. And you can also think about time-based media, physicality, models. And so we had the kind of opportunity to bring a kind of physicality to it, to the drawn work, and to make models and videos, which was really fun. And I had taken a lot of videos, which I'm sure anyone visiting sites do, so the sort of chance to kind of think about that and think about, the material coming together in a spatial and meaningful way. So this was a book of ideas. I'm interested more and more in thinking about instrumentality. And so this is from the afterword to the book by Julia Zerniak. And she sort of asked the how to get it done. And so, we can focus passionately on what to do, but how do we think about getting it done? So that's something that I carried forward with this project. And the other thing that sort of predates and postdates it is thinking about these long histories around abandonment and thinking more in terms of the contexts. Because while you could argue that the context really mattered for how I created that book, maybe the contexts don't really come through to the end user. So thinking about the biogeophysical, the socioeconomic, the racial, the cultural, that bring together land with its human and non-human constituents. And so I think in order to be instrumental, we have to have a greater understanding. We have to kind of think about the longer stories behind something and the reasons why a city transforms in the way that it does. And so, like I said, the Cyclical City Project is the project I started, and then I sort of ended, I squeezed in that other project in between. It argues for a broader temporal framing of abandonment in order to understand the overlapping political and socioeconomic trajectories and the biogeophysical evolutions that underlie the designed urban condition. In other words, it focuses on sites, circumstances, and context of abandonment, as well as the political, social, economic, and ecological underpinnings, and what are the design responses to these conditions. Because as I said, in the same case where if you have a piece of land, it may look readily available, but it's not necessarily readily available. And you can think about abandonment, say, of a post-industrial city or a shrinking city, but it's a very small time frame on a longer trajectory. And so I think people ask the question, and we'll get to it, why these 5 cities? And it's really thinking about them as having gone through cycles and being at different points in these cycles or these reciprocal notions, you might be able to understand something differently about it. The same way thinking about how we've jettisoned people and land in the past might allow us to think about different ways of doing it in the future. So it examines the differentially shifting urban landscape over these long time cycles, uncovering dramatic shifts in the landscape that can be both singular and episodic. It argues that history matters and that past actions and policies have played a fundamental role in producing and sustaining abandonment. It also counters the notion that change is unidirectional towards advancement and progress, and debunks myths that seek to generalize geographic and temporal situations. So it looks at these patterns of growth and decline and their periodic and potentially repetitive nature to kind of give out these emergent properties or these resultant landscapes of economic decline or racialized policies. So in doing so, the book tests the ideas of cycles and with regard to long-term transformation to place the problematic narrative of growth and decline in a relative and contingent lens, like growing according to what or declining according to what. It refers both to the evolution of the cities and the sites themselves, as well as the alteration to the specific material condition present. So water or plants or crops or materials, they also have cycles that exist at an elemental level and also within the built environment as development promotes and resists these cycles, and as these cycles promote and resist development. Maybe to say it much more simply, the aspiration is really to see beyond this frame. You've probably all done something like this. It's this kind of myopic 60-year comparison of then and now. It's shocking, but I think it's not a productive way of thinking about things. It's a view that despite all the rich literature available, seems really hard for us to shake. So this project, it sort of argues for this longer time frame and this way of thinking that isn't unidirectional in the direction of growth and progress, and it sort of tries to dive both wide and deep, maybe taking a metaphor from landscape. We think deep, we think sort of wide. Can we be sort of plural and specific at the same time? In order to get some other histories into the aerial slider that we saw of then and now, in order to question a preoccupation with the figure ground and other limiting binaries, in order to understand the unique properties, like the sort of DNA, if you will, of these sites and their context, and how their physical landscape characteristics are related to social, economic, and political drivers. You could ask, what does it mean to tell these longer stories? How can we trace the specific material properties if they're making and unmaking from the past through to the future, to continue to argue against these purely lot level and superficial considerations, which in a way was what led me away from the Fallow project, as much as I love it. So the book, the stories are told through the formation, tangible and intangible, of individual sites as they move through these cycles of building and unbuilding, from the overall urban space down to the material condition. So I think of them as sort of affordances and rudiments, the affordances of the land itself, and the kind of key materials that come together to support life. As Faye said, it's organized around 5 cities. And they're I'll go through them really briefly, but that each project and city is understood through a rudimentary lens and through a historical frame, a particular time frame, and through both long-form text and original drawings. And like I said, this was like the hardest studio project you've ever done, or design project you've ever done, to wrap yourself around. And it really wasn't until I thought about drawings and sort of a uniform drawing and methodology did it start to make sense to me. It sort of lost its amorphous, like, what could this project be, and became something specific and tangible that I could wrap my head around. And so I started with Philadelphia, which, as you can imagine, it's like the home city for this work. It's the first city I visited, it's the one from the beginning. And I looked at it specifically through the lens of water and through the lens of stormwater. And so each city has a particular lens that through research and through understanding, I think, is the sort of core structure of that space, a core structure both biogeophysically but also socially. And so each city, this is not all of the images for the book, but this is a sort of sequence of images from the book, and each city is drawn kind of in a specific way, moving from the cartographic scale, kind of exposing that underlying structure of the material condition. And so thinking about particular layers, in this case, the original stream shed and hydrology of the city, the sort of buried sewer stream shed, and then is looked at still cartographically and at the city scale, in terms of a plan or a big plan of the city. So somebody who's been looking at it and thinking of it. In this case, this is a map by Ian McHarg. Most of you probably recognize that. And Ian McHarg isn't necessarily known for thinking about water per se, but there's some early text and planning that he starts to unfold this idea that water is sort of at the core understanding of it. And for those of you who have looked at this, obviously this was a very different way of looking at the city. From that larger condition, it comes down to how that plays out in a particular place over time. So this is looking, also drawing from big thinkers, so drawing from Anne Winston Spurn's work and Mill Creek, and the kind of Louis Kahn Mill Creek houses in landscape with Dan Kiley and Cornelia Oberlander, kind of thinking about that scale of the city. How has those sort of blocks been shaped? How do you go through those cycles of development and undevelopment? Kind of all the way down to the life cycle of the materials themselves. So thinking of a stormwater basin as a kind of building block for a city and kind of unfolding that. So in each city, the method is the same, but the content and the frame vary drastically. So this is Berlin. It's a book chapter that centers on the kind of Gleiswildness, or the spontaneous ecologies that form along rail lines. I don't speak German, but I think they have an amazing way of being very specific with their words and their spaces. So literally there's a word that says that this is a spontaneous ecology that forms along a rail line. Have any of you been to Berlin? So it expresses itself in a really particular way. There's a sort of long legacy of thinking around that. So this looks at, in terms of the larger city, looks at the rail lines as the structuring form, looks at O.M. Unger's work with ecologist Sukop, kind of conflating those readings of the city. So on the one hand, reading the city as a series of biomes that are kind of carefully constructed. Other side, reading the city as a series of kind of fragments. How does that fit within the space? And then kind of unfolding through the destruction through the wartime destruction and the emergence of these spontaneous dry urban woodlands that came to be. It focused on a particular site that was the first conserved of these dry woodlands. So the first spontaneous vegetation site that was kind of conserved and valued around the robinia tree. So the black locust doesn't usually get a great, isn't usually a protagonist, but in this case, they made the case as this being a kind of so significant an ecological site that it deserved conservation, which may not sound amazing, but was a kind of watershed moment for the city. I'm probably going to run out of time, so I'll just go through the rest of them. In Lisbon, how many have been to Lisbon? A few. So Lisbon is one of these cities that's a city of hills. A lot of cities, people think of it as a city of hills. In this particular project, it became a city of valleys and a city of soils. And so kind of flipping a little bit the cartographic narrative of Lisbon and focusing very much on the valleys that move through the city and the ways in which those valleys have been hardened over time and how they became the armatures of a city's ecological plan directed by the landscape architect Gonzalo Rubiales Telles. And it's a plan that sort of hits the ground in these agricultural parks where you have hortas or allotment gardens that are organized for subsistent farming. And so basically looking at this long history of agronomy through the city of Berlin and kind of flipping, I guess, the reading of it to allow you to sort of have a narrative revision. These are particular sheds that are in these shown with the bamboo growing structures of the cachupa bean, which is an important bean for the Cape Verdean soups and what have you. And so just sort of thinking about how those material expressions embody the spaces. So Amsterdam, this is the one where people are like, why Amsterdam? I think for me, it's a short cycle, so it's interesting to think about a place that was known for its abandonment, but for such a short time, so for only 30 years, to explore different periods and trajectories as a part of this framework. It's looking at the interstices and the canals as a kind of armature set in dialogue with a very Dutch socialist housing expansion and playground project. And so it's also looking at sand as the kind of material underlying that. So sand as a dredging material, but sand as also a material of play. So within the Aldo van Dyck playgrounds, you have these, that's what the plan is at the bottom, these kind of sand gardens, and this idea of the sand garden as kind of the first expression of a public playground, and thinking about those sort of interplays within it. And last, but probably not, of course, least, I wanted to talk about a place where maybe the cycle is a place to work through a kind of contemporary urban abandonment. I think something that we do, and maybe just a training as an architect and a landscape architect, you try to tell the history of the present condition, which never works, but is a fun exercise to think about. And so this is looking at the highways, levees, and bridges in St. Louis, where you have sinkholes, floods, mounds, woodlands, bricks, annual plantings. You have a bunch of materials that are like St. Louis has literally built itself from the clay and limestone beneath the city, and it is literally sinking into that same clay and limestone, so a very interesting material condition that Jane Wolfe writes a lot about. But it's also a place where the kind of divided socioeconomic and racial conditions of this country are extraordinarily stark, and it's kind of, you know, a play that unfolds in many places, but in St. Louis unfolds with incredible kind of clarity and, I guess, stress. And so this was the sort of last chapter to think about those things. So I'm going to offer some sort of observations from the conclusions of the book, and maybe, I don't know how I am on time. I think I'm okay on time. I'm going to go through a little bit the action part of it, or how has this led me to different forms of action. And that part's going to be a little bit messier, because I think if you present things that have been published, they reach a measure of refinement that's quite satisfying. I think your current work is inevitably messier, but I'm not afraid of mess. Okay, so, I'll say that our world-making endeavors are relatively small. Our students sometimes liken their major as playing God, which I have my qualms with, and they are saying it a little bit as a critique, I think, of landscape architecture and its vision. So I think it's important to state that, you know, our world-making endeavors are relatively small. I think we can still push for valuation and visions that actively counter singular market-driven approaches, and I think we have a responsibility to that. And that we can see the labor of ecology to value chicory or wild carrot, and to see the labor of people not through exploitation, but through some respect and compensation. And then we can think, as we push on these alternative value systems, we can think about different spatial configurations or spatial ideas. Again, the cycles, which I've said a lot about, but also systems, hybrids, gradients, that allow us to break free of these binaries, so that before-after slider, or these linear narratives that are hard to break. And so in this project, I'm considering the overall trajectories of growth and decline, not as either growing or declining, but part of the same transformation. And at the same time, I'm trying to investigate recurrence related to landscape characteristics and design rudiments, the water, vegetal, crop, material, and life cycles. And in the end, the transformations come together to expose persistent qualities and potentials of the urban landscape. These changes are understood critically relative to other metric and decision-making cycles. So fiscal periods, political terms, decennial census counts that often lead to structural disinvestment and to limited readings of vitality. To argue that we can't make all of our decisions in the short term, but we have to think across all time scales with our actions. Further, as planners and designers, I think we tend to think in binaries, like, is this a public or a private project? Is it gonna be cultivated or spontaneous? Are we gonna mow it or are we gonna not mow it? And I think that also has limitations if we try to sort of package things. And so the projects explored are conceived of as a gradients, and that along those gradients, we can see resources deliberately allocated towards the maximum social and ecological input. The goal can neither be to return to previous levels of management and development. I swear there's not a city in this world that isn't waiting for that development to come back, but I think we can't do that, and we can't also fill every fallow space. So the strategy needs to be to allocate different levels of resource, not based on land market value, demographics, political willpower, but part of a multi-pronged effort that has equitable geographic distribution. In other words, there would be a range of carefully considered spaces of high intensity and carefully considered spaces of low intensity across sites, neighborhoods, cities, and regions. And I think that hybrid approach is going to lead to a different aesthetic condition. So to summarize the motivation, the book argues for another plot line for the potential of aggregation and transformation and the ability to empower and build communal wealth through land reform and spatial design. It unfolds a design approach and methodology that confronts the histories of colonization and systemic failure and foregrounds the specific potentials of the land itself, the importance of reciprocal change, and the particularities of cultural, political, and physical context. So this idea that like that worked here and it's going to work there, I think we can't really, that's sort of maybe the critique of the case study method I was thinking of before. These themes are explored in depth through the changing landscapes in these 5 cities across centuries, from periods of great upheaval to ones of relative stability. I'm showing you the first and the last figures of the book. A shout out to Gracie Villa, who helped with these. They probably don't make too much sense out of context, but I just want to point to sort of shifting perspectives of ways of reading the city, of the on-the-ground conditions and the design responses that value reciprocal and temporal considerations. I offer some thoughts in the conclusion of the book, and so the book, like anyone knows, was written before it came out, so these are sort of older thoughts, but I think relevant thoughts. This idea that pause breeds new formations, that fast is not better, but that in pausing, it doesn't mean we do nothing. We actually have to sort of support and empower, to question and demand, to disrupt and reorder. So the pause isn't really fruitful if you just don't do anything, but it allows you to see other potentials, and that we need to sort of think about new forms of pedagogy, practice, and project. I saw a lot of good new forms of pedagogy today, so congratulations, you guys. But we have to think about different ways that we value and understand our work as designers to kind of embrace what might be incomplete or might be evolving or might be collective, and how do we kind of communicate to people that it's okay if this isn't the sort of final anything. And so they sort of also think about different ways of working, different skill sets that you might have. Yes, you need to be able to sort of draw and think spatially, but you also need to be able to sort of listen, observe, sense, partner, splice things, imagine. Some of these are individual actions and some are collective actions. Splicing is kind of a spatial action. It's a metaphor. It's a little operation. The social psychiatrist Mindy Foley-Love, who's a sort of personal hero, talks about the ill effects of fragmentation on community, as well as a need to lower the temperature in the room. Like, you need to sort of come to a place before you do anything, which is very solid, but it's seemingly increasingly difficult advice to follow. And in the latter case, that you could sort of think about ideas of co-governance that's found in the work of scholars Sheila Foster and Christian Iannone, both that are sort of moving away from framings of capital and ownership, so away from framings of nature's capital or ecosystem services, which are still framed in a kind of monetary or capitally driven way. How do you think about the non-human owning its own labor? So thinking a little bit of the work of political theorist Alyssa Battistoni, among others. And so these are things that I'm thinking about as I'm carrying this project forward into these next decades. I'm sure there's plenty of decades worth of work to do here as I think about these regenerative cycles. And so I'm interested in an idea of a just degrowth and to thinking about the wild as a material of city making. And so I'm going to just move here from kind of more current thinking and projects and where the work is headed as we recognize a future of climate migration, a future of wilds, a future of leaving behind the places we once lived. We can reflect on how to do that differently. How can we actually unmake our social and physical landscapes so that these images, one is Youngstown, Ohio, after a political and economic rupture, cannot be so easily compared to Staten Island in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. Ecological conditions are different. One's dry, one's wet, but there's this sort of unwanted nature of abandonment that bears resemblance. Or that climate change does not become another tick on this chart, again by Mindy Foley-Love, so that the timeline of injustice and serial forced displacement does not continue with climate migration, so that we're not headed for greater fragmentation of Black and brown communities in the United States. Where fallowing becomes part of this carefully considered design process that landscape architect Kate Orff speaks of here, because to be an ethical designer of the built environment is to confront climate change as directly and forcefully as we can, and this is going to involve significant unbuilding and vast migration. And so I just want to parse the words for a minute, abandon and fallow. So I would say abandon, we will be leaving places behind. We can't simply throw them away or throw the people who are not moving away. We need to actively transform them. And so in this pause, the reason I like the word fallow is that from our, it's a sort of, it might be fallow from a human perspective, but it's active as an ecological reserve for the future. I recently, not so recently, 3 years ago, took a job in the agriculture school, and the dean then, who had sort of no idea about landscape architecture, was like, fallow. And I was like, oh, right, this is a ground in which we can communicate. But it's really, it is a productive pause. So we must understand the cyclical transformations of the urban landscape and learn from our past decisions so that unmaking is not a callous bulldozing of that which we've already basically failed, and neither is it a failed attempt to return to a previous state. So the cycles are not really cycles in the sense that they have a consistent starting point, but rather operate through a sort of transformation over time. So in some ways, the word cycle is probably not the right word. You could think more reciprocally, but it's this sort of idea of a constant evolution. And that unbuilding is an act of care and consideration that deliberately addresses our grief and manages our landscapes preemptively with the goal of long-term health of the human and non-human constituents. sort of ask, what does it mean to unbuild? How can we do it deliberately and with justice? All right, so I think when we think about this, we have to dig into the 100 years of history we have of leaving behind to kind of build reciprocal socio-ecological responses that promote nonlinear conceptions of transformation and allow us to open our minds and our landscapes to change. So I don't, because I said at the beginning, I don't really have answers or wisdoms, but I do have a few more minutes. And so I can sort of talk about the way I'm trying to transform this into action, which is really our actions of collaboration, of spreading wealth, of empowering others with our work. It's something that I started with the Climate Justice Design Fellowship that I did in collaboration with a data scientist and activist named Nathan Sanders. We were able to kind of develop a 6-month fellowship program to empower environmental justice advocates from around the United States and to work with them to design and build accessible design and data tools that would help them to promote the kind of equity and justice in their communities. The goal was to kind of directly support local communities and their leaders in advocating for their own optimal futures with respect to climate change, and to sort of support sociological design and climate research through direct collaboration with the end users of these tools, and to kind of investigate and spatialize the possible future scenarios. We were only able to run the fellowship once, sadly, but we're honored to work with 7 very diverse fellows on projects that range from increasing canopy and telling community stories of heat exposure, to developing an Afro-futurist walking tour of Harlem, to developing a framework for investigating blue lining, to critically exposing the underpinnings of climate justice indicators or environmental justice screening tools. And maybe to say something, I enjoy sort of empowering other people. It means I think that the work I do sort of moves and transforms and is like all over the place, but in a way that hopefully makes sense. And so it was done with a paid remote fellowship structure. There were group meetings, there was a mentorship program, there was one-on-one advising, and there was sort of technical support throughout the 6-month period. So really this is a project of designing a fellowship, and this was the Canopy of Stories project. I'm just showing to give a sense of how we kind of structured it, and the work that kind of came out of that, developed by a civil engineer in Portland, Oregon, Jay Brannon, and people were sort of all over the spectrum and all over the place in terms of geography, but also disciplinary interests. She used the funds and resources to create an interactive map and to kind of develop a series of surveys. So she also used the money to compensate survey participants and kind of left the work in progress. So kind of maybe from a design perspective, it's sort of ongoing work, but it became this pilot. So she was very connected to her community and kind of able to make an impact. And so she sort of extended that. She really loved the mapping, but she felt, and probably you maybe feel, that it wasn't a kind of completely accessible data source. But it did allow her to continue to work with a really rich network of partners and people to do this kind of community outreach and sort of transform the work that she did into a kind of zine, sort of empowering more people. I don't know, it's a kind of nested system. And that the county, so Oregon has a county governance system. It's one of the few in the country. The county was sort of so excited by it that they used it as a model to sort of translate some of their climate materials and frameworks, and to kind of think about this need for a community-driven plan. In the worlds of cycles, I don't know where this project stands, but in some cases we can kind of continue to kind of think about the learning that we're doing. I also kind of, I guess the ethos behind the fellowship and is something that I brought to my current position as the undergraduate program director at UConn, where we really aim to invest in the people and community-rooted projects. The program has a long history of service learning, and we're sort of working together, and maybe not to flatten our landscapes and our expressions, but to kind of think about the differences that they imply. It's done in partnership with a lot of entities, both within the university and outside of it, and it's kind of the driving mission, I think, for the program. Like I said, a long history of service learning, and kind of we're energizing this legacy with new partnerships and new approaches to kind of co-creating with human and non-human agents. And so this is the sort of snapshot of some of the partnerships that we've developed. And in some ways, through these partnerships, I've been able to come back. So if the fellowship was supporting people with the projects that they sort of brought to us, in this case, I'm able to kind of return to the fallow landscapes with a better sense of these long stories of urban transformation and more tools and experiences on how to get it done, which is maybe just a slow process of labor and love, but thinking about how to leverage the research into action. And so I think we deliberately have developed long-standing relationships. Some of them predate my time there, some of them don't, but you might have studios of 4, 5, 6 years. We stay on kind of on an advisory role with this work, and we've been building long-term partnerships in the Hartford region, in Bridgeport, the two that I'm showing here, but kind of in other places as well. And so thinking through, this way of working as a kind of long-term endeavor. In Hartford, maybe, which is, this is Bridgeport, that is Hartford. In the Hartford region, maybe I'm most directly coming back to some of the ideas of urban transformation. I received a grant and funding to look at agricultural practices and labor migrations in the Connecticut River Valley, and how those have kind of influenced urban transformation in Hartford. So this is ongoing work, both, I guess, physically addressing the legacy landscapes of agriculture that exists. So the Connecticut River Valley, once one of the most fertile agricultural regions, is being transformed. You might imagine what that agricultural land is becoming. You can think of distribution centers, solar fields, perhaps housing. So thinking a little bit more critically about that land and whose kind of land it is, whose history it is, through a project in Simsbury, and then thinking even larger about how we maintain an understanding of our urban transformations and their regional impacts through kind of cycles of capital and material flow. And so that's a project where I'm, I guess, continuing to look at it. You could think of Hartford as another a next city and kind of investigating this. And then in Bridgeport, Bridgeport has the longest shoreline in Connecticut. It's at the mouth of the Pequannock River, which sits in Fairfield County, the wealthiest county in maybe the United States. Bridgeport is a city predominantly of color, predominantly of poverty, sitting at the mouth of this river, sort of collecting all of the injustice at the mouth of it. Like I said, it has the largest largest shoreline. 70% of it is inaccessible to the populations, and so we've been working on a series of projects, kind of highlighted in orange, about how to open up that waterfront, how to engage with those particular communities, how to address issues of flooding and heat and sea level rise through them. We do projects in partnership with the City of Bridgeport, with the Trust for Public Land, with Groundwork Bridgeport, with the Connecticut chapter of the ASLA, among others, and it's a slow process. And so through the studio transformations, we're able to sort of build community partnerships, but also support grants and support funding. So the Sliver by the River project is now in design development and is fully funded to sort of go forward. And we're sort of thinking about how those particular projects and those partnerships sort of breed hope, and in terms of that pause, what can be done. And then I guess maybe to return to this idea of pause and cadence, and maybe to think a little bit about joy at this particular moment, and this idea that our landscape needs a pause. Sometimes our students need a pause. This is the first day of class this semester. These students are playing cards. And I've never seen such joy and excitement in the classroom. I did ask them for a playlist too, so you can imagine them listening to their playlist, as diverse as you could even imagine. They're sort of playing cards, and they're preparing to design a set of playing cards for their studio site in Hartford, in partnership with each other, but also thinking about those cards as a way to engage. We're working with an organization called Rise Up for the Arts that does a lot of mural work in the city, but also does a lot of work with youth programming, with bringing art into schools, with designing different pathways for students, non-traditional pathways through high school. So sort of thinking about those cards as a means of entry, as a means of understanding. This is a card that one of the students drew of our community partner. He hung it up at his desk. He was sort of so excited. Here they are in that space, kind of exploring ways of understanding the city and kind of thinking about the past, present, and future of that particular space. And so maybe I'll leave with the questions that I still ask, the kind of key questions to wrap up. I think I'm sufficiently at time. What if pause, instead of being stagnant, breeds new formations? It's starting to do that in this particular post-industrial neighborhood, but I think there's a lot more to be done relative to the ecological footprint of that space. I think a lot of the youth are really excited about the potential of landscape and of being able to engage with their landscapes. What if pause allows the time necessary to support, empower, question and demand, disrupt and reorder? That's what I had already, I think, said, but just to drive that home. And what if our work, instead of aiming for totality, embraces the incomplete, the evolving, the wild, the collective? To me, these are fruitful questions. I have the benefit of having a kind of lab structure at the University of Connecticut. So in our lab, we're sort of thinking about the future of abandoned landscapes and communities, as well as the lessons this past abandonment might have for these other places within a frame of long and regenerative cycles. So, excellent. Thank you.
So much, Jill. So you all know the drill. We're going to open it up for questions. I think I'm going to start with one just to help break the ice a little bit. It's like a pretty small and easy question maybe to kind of start. But so you do a lot of the drawings. It seems like most of the drawings yourself. You had also a collaborator for one of the projects. And I was just curious, what's your drawing process like? How do you decide what to draw and where to begin? And what that looks like.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think I've had the benefit of having a few research assistants and associates, and I should have, in some ways, I always think you should start with the acknowledgments of the book. Like they aren't necessarily all, I didn't draw them all by myself from hand, and I think multiple people have sort of worked on them. I think, what is my drawing? I also teach hand drawing, which is kind of exciting to me, or whether it's hand drawing on the iPad or whatever. In the spirit of pause, I think it's really nice to draw and to practice that. Like, I'm not amazing at hand drawing, and I tell my students who are like horrified by the idea of hand drawing because maybe it's a practice. Like, I think up until a certain age in education, we're encouraged to draw, and then there's a moment where people sort of stop drawing, but it's really just a sort of skill, and I think it takes practice, and in some ways, I think one of the things that's nice is our drawings don't really have to be beautiful or even, some people draw beautifully, and you could explain an idea to someone and they could see it. I don't really draw that way, but to me, it's a really nice way of kind of thinking, of sort of hand to hand thinking. Like I said, with the From Fallow project, it was helpful to write a little bit, so to sort of, write something evocative and then see if you could draw that something evocative. I think, I don't know if this is a good or a bad thing, but a lot of places that are resource strapped are also data strapped. And so we think that like all the data in the world exists. But there's a lot of places where data doesn't exist, especially if you're thinking about vacant land, which is a slightly nebulous concept. And so there's a process of getting data. Like a lot of those drawings, those maps have a data source to begin with, but there's a lot of making of that data that has to happen as well. And I think, when we have so much data, our tendency is to want to grab it all, and I think then it's just chaos or something like it. So I like to sort of think about the structure of things and then work with the data to sort of relate that structure. I think maybe Rhino's the best piece of software out there for any form of drawing. I don't know, it's like the most user-friendly. It's relatively affordable. It's like, I haven't tried all of the new amazing things out there, but to me, it's like it's a nice place to be. So I like to think, I like to draw things 2D, think about them in Rhino, sort of sketch them by hand back and forth, and to have an idea, I guess, of what the thesis of the drawing is, even if it changes before. So maybe not to let the data drive the drawing, but support it and maybe change the thesis as it goes. But to me, it's a tool of thinking. And then I think for the ones that go back through time, like I do really enjoy doing that historical research and deep dive. And so a lot of those did have to involve some form of tracing of past conditions and what have you.
Hello. I don't remember the last time I spoke to Mike. Hello. I am not a design student. I'm just here because I'm interested in the topic. I have a few acres here, and I plan on doing some landscaping, and I want to turn it into a park. And in terms of just honoring the nature and sustainability and working with it's very hills. It's not flat line, and it's fully wooded. So I want to be intentional about what trees I take down. And I suppose my question to you is, do you suggest should it be fenced in or out? Because I was thinking of animals and leaving some room open, but also I live on a main road, so protection from trucks and, a lot of traffic. So I wanted to see your take on that.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Thank you for the question. I mean, I think there's probably not one answer to that question, and I think in general it's nice to be in a place and to see a place, and if you can spend some time with the place before you do something, which it seems like you are doing. I guess my overall thoughts around fencing is that and sometimes it could have an ecological benefit in terms of like the way in which seeds are dispersed or things like that. You might get more ecological diversity around the fence. One of the partners that we work in Hartford does a lot of work around food, and he's always he's always like, but it's sort of for everyone. So I think my general ethos is not to like say fence out the deer or to like, I don't know, you're not going to keep anything in and out that easily. Like the same thing goes for like a wall with water or these things. So I think working with the sort of habitat that is desired and kind of shaping that through time would be advantageous, I think. Especially if you're saying you want it. I don't know if you want the park to be for more people, but in general, landscapes are very relational. So anything you do will sort of have a broader relationship, and they sort of have their lifelines through connection. And so you could, design the most beautiful space in the world, but if it's not connected, both physically or emotionally or in any way to people, I think it's not really going to resonate, and it's not going to get sort of the care and attention that it has. So I think thinking about those connections and the ways in which you connect to the land are key. And then maybe to my time standpoint, thinking about phasing over longer periods of time. Like it tends to be maybe in terms of our disciplinary formation is that we like made a plan, and then it's like a plan for implementation on a day. And then the idea is that, and the great thing about it is that it will grow and it sort of transform and change, but it doesn't really work like that you want everything to have been planted at once or all of the sort of change to happen at once. So I think having a kind of longer term care plan for it is almost as important as any individual like move that you make. Yeah. You're welcome.
You should take some classes in our school. Other questions?
When you were doing the 100, from Fallow.
Yeah.
did you see any cases of like these interventions being made and the landowners or the abandoners or city like having an issue with that, or were they supportive, or like did people just do it and hope that they got away with it, or like how did that relationship agitate itself?
I mean, so I think there's a lot in that question. Thank you for the question. I think something that we didn't really, so I think in certain places, yes, like people, like there's so much land and there's so much available land, people can do things, and whether it's supported or just people are okay with it, I think it's fine. I mean, I think it works for a minute. I think the thing that maybe to this day is a question is that I think landscapes are inherently thought of as temporary, or like easy to displace. And so I think, you know, in the short term, by all means, but like when we get that XYZ, then no, we're gonna sort of displace this idea. And like a city, you know, cities obviously rely on taxes and there's all sorts of questions. So like, even if the property has been there for 40 years and nothing is happening, to convince them that you should take that property for 40 years and develop a kind of landscape that is a hard sell. I'm currently on the task force for the mayor of Hartford, has a kind of vacant land task force, and it remains one of the more frustrating experiences. Is it's really just an opportunity to find places for housing, even though, anyways, I could go on and on. So I'll just step back from that in a sense. So I think, you know, if there's no other demands, I think it's going well. I think if there's other plans, often, you know, there's another round of forced displacement. I think having that ongoing care is an issue. So you might have someone who's really excited about this for a period of time and then not, and there's sort of no no strategy for like the long term. And then I think, you know, in places where the property abandonment is not as extreme, then you have these questions around gentrification and the kind of the forced displacement resulting in the green gentrification. So I think on the one hand, it's very exciting and optimistic. Like you can experiment, you can do things. I think, you know, you need to do that responsibly. And also I think just, I don't know, continuing to make the long case for the long term or the large scale or the actual transformation that might be possible.
Thank you.
Maybe just to follow that though, I mean, there are, I think, a lot of programs like an Adopt a Lot or like an adjacent, you know, I can't even think right now, it's been a long day, but anyways, when you give the property over, slide lot transfer, like I think there's a lot of, and those are great. I think the scale of it is very individual. So I think there is support for people taking care of the landscape, but yeah. It maybe also doesn't speak to the potential property reform. So like the idea is then you could transfer that to an individual. Anyways, a rambling answer.
Thanks, Daryl. Thanks for your presentation. In your studios, how do you navigate like all of the different things that faculty feel like they need to speak on, like theory, history, policy, then the actual design processes? And yeah, I'm just curious, like navigating policy in particular and design strategy.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think there's maybe a distinction to be made to a graduate level studio versus an undergraduate level studio. I think in all of them, you have a responsibility to uncover the history, to sort of explain the questions of policy that are being engaged to, and I think you can do it to differing degrees in terms of, I guess, the time and the experience and the pedagogical goals of the studio. I think my thought is maybe sometimes we bite off a lot. the site is huge, and then you're going to phase it, and then you're going to have 3 strategies, and you're going to be in multiple neighborhoods and things like that. And so I think sometimes maybe you have to parse those ideas. So like if you have the joy of having like a seminar and a studio that can support each other, maybe you can discuss some things in the seminar and some in the studio. I think that you have to maybe contain the objectives of the, like you can't do everything in every studio, but I think you need to understand the complexity. So it's either like a smaller scale site or a particular time frame, or something that's going to allow you a little bit of depth versus the sort of breadth of the idea that we're generalists. I think maybe is a question. I think also you have an entire, I guess, curriculum in a way in the studios. So thinking about how the studios interface with each other and what are the like overall objectives, and every one studio can't do all of those overall objectives. And so I think thinking broadly about the entire curriculum, and not just the studios, like the theory classes, the other things, like how do they, I don't know, in total address the issues that you have. I think the other thing is to maybe on the collaboration front, I was sort of taught maybe almost everything by a landscape architect or designer in some way, and I think leaning into those collaborations. So we have some colleagues in the School of Public Policy who can come and be much more synthetic and sort of comprehensive about the policy implications. And so I think inviting those and sort of having it be a process throughout the studio. So maybe not just a one-off lecture, but actually having studio partners that can speak to a number of things, so that you are not, like, we're generalists, which is great, and I think, but I think you also need specialists, and you need to work with other disciplines and things like that, which is going to translate later. Like in some ways, working with other disciplines is a pedagogical goal. You could sort of list that out in your course objectives. So I think maybe relying is the wrong word, but just building these partnerships where you're kind of working on a project and you're doing different aspects of that project.
I have a comment / I don't know if it's a question. I might ramble a little bit, but I was really excited kind of towards the end of your presentation, where you're getting into the action and things are a little messier, where you had mentioned this idea of exploring degrowth, and then you had a lovely image of a field where there were flowers, and then it really grew after like a flood, or I don't remember the specifics of the image, but and it just sparked this idea of excitement, at least in my mind, that yes, we might be struggling with economic degrowth, but are there ways to look at the regrowth of landscape during these times to help us find some kind of inspiration or stability? And I think what's been really interesting in your work and your presentation is when you're talking about kind of these development, the cycles of development. I think what kind of maybe in my mind becomes like a block is this idea that developers, for example, will look at a vacant land and just see value when there's a building on it, or value when there's some kind of program. And I'm not trying to beat up on architects in the room. I am half an architect here, but I'm curious if there are ways that in your research arguments or examples or precedents that you're finding where folks are able to kind of turn the table on that argument, where it's like, just let this forest actually grow into something. In 100 years, you might not be able to enjoy it, but like your kids, it's gonna be this and that, or I don't know. I don't know if you're coming across maybe some of those stories in your work.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and I think it continues. I mean, I do think there are examples of that for sure. I mean, I think it's less clear the kind of, I don't know, I think we're still in this sort of market-driven, property-driven economy. And so I think you can make the argument for the value and the ecological value and the sort of climate value. And I think there are people who are committed to their landscapes. Whether they can like stand up to, like I think they can stand up on a sociocultural level. I think people could sort of, and I think there obviously, I think the reason people are so excited about Berlin and other places like that is there are sort of policies that underlie that sort of support it. So I think there's some capacity. I mean, I think in being part of the plant science department, we have, I think the opportunity to try to test some things. So I think there's two questions. One is like, can it stand up to development? And the other is like, nascent landscapes tend to be not that aesthetically pleasing. So like, it may look not amazing for like 10 years or something like that. I think it's also why like, as landscape architects, you're sort of forced into this idea of like overplanting, which maybe can work in some ecological standpoints, but in sometimes it's like really detrimental, but you like need it to look a certain way. So I think we some of these like land labs and these sort of processes I think are kind of building this argument of and kind of getting more data and more metrics, even if, you know, like I think plus the kind of experiential experience of it will sort of push it. So I think if you can demonstrate how it's working on multiple levels, I think you can get excitement. And I think then if you can get, so you need some like policy, you need a few more people on the team to be excited about it. So I think there are more kind of economists looking into degrowth and things like that. So like, I think just like building a team in that regard to think about it.
So we're doing a project in our studio right now focusing on Knoxville College, which is like a largely abandoned HBCU, just a few minutes that way. And one of the things that I've been really struggling with in terms of creating a design and working with this project is like, it's perceived as a blight almost, like all these falling apart buildings, contrasted with like a freshly mown lawn. It's kind of like a weird mishmash, but when you're talking to someone or trying to persuade someone of the beauty or the value in decay or fallow or even like rot, if you want to use that word, like versus, you know, just traditional basic design, like how do you kind of push for that or like persuade them otherwise, especially because, you know, down here not everyone believes in climate change or environmental benefits, so that's not always a good thing to sell it with. So I'm just curious how you may have tackled that, if you have in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always yeah, I mean, why it's decades-long work. I mean, I think there's still I think there's still a lot of perception around what is a cared-for landscape, what is a kind of culturally relevant landscape, what is maybe a beautiful landscape in a certain way. I mean, I think, you know, humans are fairly adaptable. So I think a lot of that has to do with, I don't know, your cultural formation, your understanding of things. I mean, I think there are kind of labor, and you're saying I can't use any like ecological biodiversity benefit. I'm going to argue for it.
You can sometimes, but I find that like if you use, especially with like climate change, right? Not everyone's gonna buy that. You know, I just didn't know if there were other things that you could often resort to.
Yeah, I think I mean, like anything, I think it's a maybe pronged argument. I think if you could convince people that they could have something as cared for as a lawn that wasn't mowed and had like ecological value and things like that, they'd be excited not to be, mowing their lawn every day or like taking care of things in a certain way. I think there's also a process of adaptation, like starting with a small test and kind of thinking about like, sort of, I guess, working with people to understand that space. I think, there are things people are more drawn to, maybe pollinators or birds are often really exciting, or other kinds of animals moving through spaces. I think it's also pretty contextual. Like if I spent some time in Ohio where like a meadow in a campus or a suburban context was seen as like beautiful, rolling, and then you put it in a context with abandoned buildings or something like that, and the immediate sort of reference is, blight, or it doesn't seem safe, or it doesn't seem all of these things. I mean, I think there are data pieces, but I think if you're trying to appeal to certain heartstrings, there's some other pieces. I think how you work with a particular species, like if you coordinate the blooms in certain way. I mean, there's probably data out there on things that people, regardless, are sort of drawn to that then can be interspersed within the argument. I think sometimes taking people places and seeing if that sort of like being in that nature, because in some ways most people like to be in a kind of, I don't know, maybe that's a strong statement, but a lot of people appreciate nature, in quotes. So I think kind of thinking about ways in which to translate that might make sense. But in some ways it's part of the work that we do, and sometimes it's really frustrating. But I think if you keep pushing at it and keep trying different strategies, maybe part of our curriculum should be in like persuasion or something like that. I don't know. I mean, it's only getting harder also with the long term, like the more short media clips or the more frenetic we consume information and things like that. I mean, I think there's a lot of mental health research around mental health and the sort of improvements that people are seeing in mental health, which might, or other kind of human health outcomes, that might be ways to think about it as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I think we are at time. Thank you so much, Jill.
You're welcome. Or am I clapping for myself? I don't know.